By the time Clara Winsome reached the gates of Addington Manor, the evening fog had already begun to swallow the surrounding woods. The ironwork, warped and rusted, groaned in protest as she forced it open, the sound echoing like a moan across the empty grounds. She had read about this place for years, traced its name through brittle archives and whispered footnotes, but the manor itself loomed far larger, far older than she had ever imagined. Its windows were shuttered, its chimneys long cold, yet something about the stillness felt watched, as though the house itself had been waiting for her return. Clara Winsome had always been drawn to forgotten histories, the kind buried beneath polite records, where dates faded and names vanished into silence. Her fascination with the Addington family began not with a grand discovery, but with a single missing document. While combing through the county archives for her thesis on Victorian estate architecture, she found a gap, an abrupt absence in the registry where the Addington name should have been. 7 generations were accounted for, then nothing. It was as though the entire family had been carefully erased, their estates transferred, their holdings dissolved, their existence unspoken. Curiosity might have ended there for another researcher, but for Clara, the omission was an invitation. Over the years, she followed the family's trail through fragments of letters, auction receipts, and censored newspaper clippings that hinted at scandal, misfortune, and a single, unmarked death. Every clue pointed back to the same location, the sprawling Addington Manor that had stood silent for over a century on the edge of a forgotten woodland. She arrived in late autumn, when the air was sharp enough to sting and the sun seemed reluctant to rise. The road leading to the manor was little more than a dirt path swallowed by trees, their bare branches knotted like veins against the grey sky. Her carriage driver, a local man with deep-set eyes, refused to take her further than the broken milestone a mile from the gates. He muttered something about the house not liking visitors and turned his horse before she could argue. Clara walked the remaining stretch alone, her suitcase dragging through the mud, the wheels of her lantern case clinking faintly with each step. The silence grew thicker as she neared the property, the usual sounds of forest life, birds, insects, even wind through the leaves, fading into an unnatural hush. When she finally reached the gates, the first thing she noticed was the metal itself. The iron bars were twisted in strange, almost deliberate shapes, not merely the result of time or neglect. Vines had wrapped themselves around the framework like skeletal fingers, and an ornate crest at the center, a rearing stag beneath a crescent moon, was barely visible beneath the rust. Clara ran her gloved hand across it, feeling the raised etching beneath the corrosion. The metal was cold, far colder than the air. She pushed, expecting the hinges to resist, but the gate moved with a drawn-out groan that rolled across the fog-covered grounds, echoing like a moan. Beyond lay the manor. It rose from the mist like a monument to something long dead. Its stone walls were dark and damp, streaked with age, the roof sagging in places where slate had fallen away. A once grand fountain stood in the center of a courtyard choked with weeds, its basin filled not with water but a tangle of blackened leaves. The windows, tall and narrow, were all shuttered from within, giving the house the appearance of a blind giant. Clara paused, her breath forming faint clouds before her. The rational part of her mind reminded her that old buildings had a presence, that architecture could evoke emotion through sheer scale and shadow. Yet there was something different about Addington Manor. It wasn't just imposing, it was expectant, like a stage waiting for its players to return. She stepped through the gate, the crunch of gravel beneath her boots unnervingly loud in the stillness. The path leading to the front doors curved past marble statues so weathered they barely resembled human forms. One, positioned near the entryway, seemed to bow slightly, though the head had long since eroded away. As she approached the massive oak doors, she noticed faint scratches around the handles, as though someone, or something, had tried to claw their way inside. The historian in her noted the details mechanically, but a small pulse of unease began to thrum beneath her curiosity. Inside her satchel, she carried a small notebook, ink, and an old photograph she'd found among the archived estate sales, a portrait of the Addington family taken sometime in the late 1800s. 7 figures stood arranged before the manor's steps, a patriarch with a severe expression, a woman seated beside him, and 5 children whose faces seemed strangely blurred even in the original photograph. The image had been mislabeled, almost deliberately, with another family's name written in faded script. That detail had convinced her the Addingtons were not merely forgotten, they had been *****. When she finally reached the door, she hesitated. The brass knocker, a lion's head, was still intact, though its features were worn smooth by time. She raised her hand, intending to knock, but before she could, the wind shifted, and one of the upper shutters creaked open slightly. She froze, her eyes darting upward. For an instant, she thought she saw movement behind the glass, a flicker of white, perhaps a curtain or the brief reflection of her own lantern, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Telling herself it was just the light, she pressed forward and rapped 3 times on the door. No answer came. Instead, the sound of her knocking reverberated strangely, as though the house swallowed it, absorbing the noise into its walls. She waited, heart thudding, and then turned the handle. To her surprise, it moved freely. The door opened inward with a sigh, revealing a vast hallway cloaked in shadow. The air that spilled out was stale, heavy with dust and the faint metallic scent of old decay. Clara stepped inside, her lantern casting weak light across the marble floor. Cobwebs hung like drapes from the ceiling, and the portraits that lined the corridor seemed to lean inward, their faces lost to grime. Somewhere deeper within, something creaked, a beam settling, perhaps, or a door moving of its own accord. She tried to steady her breathing, reminding herself that she was not here to be frightened but to uncover the truth. And yet, as the door closed behind her with a soft, final click, the temperature seemed to drop. The stillness grew thicker, almost tangible, and Clara felt an inexplicable sensation, a certainty that she was no longer alone, that the house had been waiting for this moment, for her, and that its long silence had finally been broken. Clara had always found portraits unsettling. Even in the safety of museums, she felt the painted eyes followed her, holding secrets the artist had never meant to share. But in Addington Manor, the sensation became something else entirely, something oppressive. It began 2 days after she arrived, when she discovered a small brass key hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the library. The key was old, its teeth oddly shaped, and it bore a faint engraving of the same crescent moon from the Addington crest. There were dozens of locked doors in the house, most swollen shut by damp and neglect, but the key seemed to almost hum in her hand, as though it already knew where it belonged. She followed that instinct, letting it guide her down the west corridor where the air was heavier, the dust thicker, and the scent of age carried something metallic beneath it, like dried blood. The door she found there was unlike the others. It stood at the far end of the hall, tall and narrow, carved with a pattern of interlocking vines that climbed its surface. Faded red curtains hung on either side, framing it like a stage. When she pressed the key into the lock, the metal turned more easily than expected, and the mechanism gave a soft, reluctant click, as though it had been waiting for her touch. The door opened with a long, sighing groan, and a rush of stagnant air spilled into the corridor. Inside was a room untouched by time. Dust swirled lazily in the light that slipped through a single crack in the boarded window, and rows of canvases lined the walls, each veiled by linen cloths. Her pulse quickened. A portrait room, she thought, a gallery, perhaps, hidden from public record. She set her lantern on a small table near the door and approached the nearest canvas. The linen was so fragile it crumbled slightly when she tugged at it. Beneath, the face of a man emerged, pale, sharp-featured, his eyes fixed forward with unnatural intensity. His clothes suggested late 19th century, the brushwork refined, but something about the expression unsettled her. The corners of his mouth were drawn back slightly, not in a smile but in tension, and the eyes, though beautifully rendered, held a terror she could almost feel. She moved to the next portrait and uncovered it slowly. A woman this time, hair coiled tightly, hands clasped in her lap. At first, she thought her expression was solemn, but as she looked closer, she noticed the faint tremor in the painted fingers, the way her lips seemed parted as if caught mid-breath. Clara's hand trembled as she reached for another cloth. One by one, she revealed the entire collection, men, women, and children, each rendered in exquisite detail, each bearing that same look of frozen dread. There were more than a dozen portraits in total, and the more she studied them, the more she realized they were all members of the same family. She recognized faces from the photograph in her notebook, the patriarch, the matron, the eldest daughter. But the most chilling discovery came when she compared the dates scrawled on the backs of the frames with the genealogical records she had copied from the archives. Every portrait had been painted asterisk after asterisk the subject's death. Her rational mind tried to explain it. Posthumous portraits were not uncommon among the wealthy. Yet there was something wrong with these, something impossible. The artistry was too vivid, the emotion too immediate. It was as if the painter had not imagined their faces but seen them, moments before they were taken. She stepped back, her lantern flickering, casting long, wavering shadows across the room. For an instant, the effect was grotesque. The painted figures seemed to shift, their eyes glinting in the dim light as though wet with tears. In the corner, partially hidden by an overturned chair, she noticed a smaller canvas. It was different from the others, unfinished, the brushstrokes rough, the colors muted. She lifted it carefully, brushing away dust to reveal the faint outline of a woman standing near a window, her head turned as if listening to something outside the frame. But what caught Clara's attention was the faint reflection painted in the glass of the window. There, barely visible, was another figure, tall, indistinct, standing behind the woman, its face obscured entirely by shadow. She felt the hair on her neck rise. The artist's signature at the bottom corner was nothing more than an initial, *A*. As she stared, the quiet in the room began to feel unnatural. The house had many sounds, creaking beams, the slow whisper of wind through cracks, but here, it was too still, too deliberate. Then came the faintest rustle, like fabric shifting. Clara turned sharply. The curtains at the back of the room stirred though there was no draft. She stood motionless, holding her breath, her mind warring between reason and instinct. Slowly, the fabric settled again, draping once more in perfect stillness. She exhaled shakily, forcing herself to catalogue what she had found. But as she turned back to the portraits, her lantern light caught on something that hadn't been there before. A faint glimmer, moisture, perhaps, at the edge of one canvas. She leaned closer and froze. A thin line of red, dark and viscous, traced down from the painted woman's eye, cutting a path through the layers of dust. It was absurd, impossible, but the longer she looked, the more certain she became that it was fresh. The air in the room thickened, pressing against her lungs. Somewhere deep within the manor, a door slammed, the sound echoing up through the floorboards. Clara stumbled back, knocking over her lantern. The light wavered, flaring and dimming, and in that half-second of flickering illumination, she thought she saw the painted faces change, their eyes no longer staring ahead, but all turning toward her. The discovery of the hidden passage began with sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping that woke Clara sometime after midnight. The manor was vast and old, and its nights were filled with noises, beams shifting, shutters breathing in the wind, the occasional scurry of something small within the walls. But this sound was deliberate. It came at intervals, soft but steady, as though someone, or something, were knocking from within the structure itself. Clara sat upright in the narrow bed of the guest chamber, her candlelight trembling against the damp wallpaper. The tapping came again, closer this time, and with it a whispering draft that lifted the edge of the crimson curtain by the far window. She rose, her bare feet brushing against the cold wood, and crossed the room. The window was shut tight, the latch rusted into place, yet the curtain continued to stir as though stirred by a breath. Her eyes followed the fabric upward and froze on a faint outline near the ceiling, a seam, too straight to be a crack, running vertically behind the curtain's folds. The memory of the portrait room came rushing back, the hidden door, the air that smelled of rot and turpentine. She hesitated only a moment before lighting her lantern and drawing the curtain aside. Behind it, half concealed by the rotted velvet, was a narrow wooden panel, its edges warped and blackened with age. It looked as though it had once been painted over, perhaps in an attempt to disguise it completely. At its center was a faint indentation, the shape of a circle. Clara pressed her hand against it, expecting resistance, but the panel shifted slightly under her palm, and the tapping stopped. Then, with a low, shuddering creak, the panel began to open inward, revealing a black gap just wide enough for her to step through. The air that drifted out was colder than anything she had felt in the house before, carrying with it the unmistakable scent of mildew and stone. Lantern in hand, she peered inside. The passageway beyond was narrow and steep, descending into darkness, the walls lined with rough-hewn brick slick with moisture. A faint shimmer of cobwebs glistened in the lamplight. She hesitated, every rational impulse urging her to close the panel and walk away, but curiosity, an almost feverish compulsion, pulled her forward. As she stepped inside, the wood gave a muffled sigh behind her, and the door swung shut, sealing her in. The lantern's glow barely reached the first bend of the staircase. The steps were uneven, carved directly into the stone foundation. Each one creaked under her weight, the sound echoing far too long, as though the space around her were much larger than what her light revealed. Dust floated thickly in the air, disturbed by her movement, and the deeper she descended, the more oppressive the air became. The smell changed too. It wasn't just damp now but tinged with something sour, like old copper or rusted metal. She stopped once, pressing her ear to the wall, and thought she heard it again, that faint tapping, now distant, irregular, like a heartbeat muffled through earth. When she reached the bottom, she found herself standing in a narrow corridor barely wide enough for her shoulders. It stretched into shadow on either side, the floor slick beneath her boots. The walls were lined with old wallpaper that had long since peeled away in strips, revealing what looked like older markings beneath, painted symbols, faint and angular, winding in a looping pattern that disappeared into darkness. Clara traced one of them with her fingertip. The paint felt oddly fresh, though the air was too stale for anyone to have been there recently. A soft fluttering broke the silence. She turned sharply, raising her lantern, and saw movement at the far end of the passage. For a moment she thought it was a rat, but the motion was too fluid, too human. The shape darted across the corridor and vanished into another opening, leaving behind a faint echo like fabric brushing against stone. Clara's pulse quickened. She called out, her voice trembling, but the sound was swallowed almost instantly. There was no reply, no sign of another presence, only the rhythmic dripping of water somewhere deep within the walls. She moved forward cautiously, her lantern illuminating fragments of old furniture, a collapsed chair, a broken frame, the remnants of candle holders long extinguished. At last she reached the end of the corridor, where the walls opened into a small chamber. It must once have been part of the manor's foundation, perhaps a servant storage area or an old wine cellar, but the layout was strange. Heavy curtains hung along each wall, faded and mold-stained, their original color barely discernible. They seemed out of place, decadent fabric in a space meant for dust and stone. Clara reached for the nearest one and drew it aside. Behind it was not a wall but another door, thin, wooden, and unmarked. She pushed gently, and it opened onto a hollow alcove where nothing but air waited. Yet when she stepped closer, she felt warmth, impossible warmth, blooming against her face as though the space exhaled. She pulled back sharply, her breath catching in her throat. For an instant, she thought she heard voices, soft, indistinct, and layered, like dozens of whispers blending together. They were not words she could understand, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, pleading. She stumbled backward, the lantern swinging wildly, its flame flickering against the hanging curtains, and in that brief chaos of light and shadow, she caught a glimpse of something that made her heart seize. One of the curtains at the far end moved, not drifted, but shifted, pulled from within by an unseen hand. A pale outline pressed through the fabric, the curve of fingers, the faint trace of a face just beneath the surface. Then it was gone, leaving only the heavy silence behind. Clara stood frozen, her mind struggling to comprehend what she had seen. The house above was ancient, forgotten, but what lay behind these curtains felt a live star. She turned and fled up the stairs, the air thickening around her, the passage whispering as though the walls themselves were trying to keep her from leaving. When she burst back into the guest chamber, gasping for breath, the curtain fell still behind her, but the faint scent of earth and decay lingered in the air, as if the darkness below had followed her back. The whispers began the following evening, faint and almost tender, like the murmur of someone speaking through a dream. At first, Clara thought they were echoes of her imagination, a trick of exhaustion and candlelight. The manor was vast and heavy with silence, so any stray sound, wood settling, a window breathing in its frame, seemed amplified by the stillness. Yet these whispers were different. They carried shape and rhythm, rising and falling in a cadence that almost resembled speech. She had taken refuge in the library, determined to document her findings from the hidden chamber. Her notes lay open on the desk, the ink still glistening when the sound began, drifting from the far side of the room where the shelves met the darkened wall. It was not a voice she recognized, nor could she discern the words, but it carried an unmistakable familiarity, as though it spoke directly to her and not into the air. She held her breath and listened. The whisper grew clearer, threading itself through the silence. Her name, soft, elongated, seemed to form within it. The voice lingered for an instant, then faded, replaced by another, lower and rougher, murmuring too quickly to understand. Her pulse quickened. She turned toward the sound, her lantern trembling in her hand, casting golden arcs across the shelves. The books, centuries old, looked as though they had not been touched in decades, yet one of them shifted slightly as if disturbed by a faint breeze. She approached slowly, reaching out, and froze when the whisper came again, this time closer, directly behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. The library stretched long and shadowed, and for a moment, the air itself seemed to hum, vibrating faintly against her ears. Then the sound stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the voices, pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. She forced herself to return to her desk, though her hands trembled too violently to write. She told herself it was fatigue, the consequence of isolation and sleepless nights. But deep down, she already sensed the truth: the house was no longer content to stay silent. That night, she dreamed of corridors she had never seen, narrow halls lined with red curtains that moved like lungs, breathing in time with her heartbeat. Faces formed within the folds, pale and watchful, their lips moving though no sound escaped. When she woke, the whispering had returned, low and distant, drifting from somewhere beneath the floorboards. It came in waves now, soft at first, then rising like a tide before sinking again into silence. Clara pressed her ear to the wooden planks. The sound was unmistakable, a chorus of voices, led atop one another, each distinct yet speaking in unison. They were not merely echoes of the dead but something far more desperate, their words blurred by time, pleading to be heard. She followed the noise through the corridors, the lantern's flame bending under the draft that seemed to move with her. The whispers guided her like a current, pulling her toward the grand staircase that led to the manor's central hall. As she descended, the air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp stone and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. The whispers swelled, circling her, threading through the cracks in the walls and the seams of the doors. Every surface seemed to vibrate with unseen energy, as though the entire house were murmuring under its breath. When she reached the bottom of the stairs, the source of the sound became clear. The great curtains that lined the ballroom, those same crimson drapes she had seen upon arrival, were trembling, though the air was still. The whispering was strongest there, emanating from behind the heavy fabric. Her instinct screamed to flee, but she stepped forward instead, unable to resist. As she neared the curtains, the murmurs sharpened into words, their meaning distorted but unmistakably human. She could make out fragments, release, beneath, remember, woven between gasps and sighs. The voices were not malicious, but they carried a terrible sorrow, the kind that seeped into bone. Clara reached out and touched the curtain. The velvet was cold and damp, as though it had been soaked in water. The whispers halted instantly. For a heartbeat, the silence returned, vast and suffocating. Then, without warning, a single voice spoke clearly, from directly beside her ear. "Clara!" She stumbled back, the lantern nearly slipping from her grasp. The sound was not imagined, it had weight, presence. She turned toward it, but no one was there. Only the curtain swayed gently, as though something behind it had just moved away. Her breathing came shallow and fast. She whispered into the dark, asking who was there, what they wanted, but the reply was not in words. The entire hall seemed to exhale, and in that breath came 1,000 murmurs overlapping, laughter, weeping, the faint echo of footsteps pacing unseen. She clutched her lantern tighter and backed toward the stairs. As she did, the flame flickered violently and then went out, plunging her into darkness. For a moment, she stood frozen, her own heartbeat loud enough to drown everything else. Then she heard it again, her name, whispered in perfect unison by countless unseen mouths, rising from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. She fled blindly through the darkness, her fingers scraping against the wallpaper as she searched for the nearest door. The whispers followed, threading through the corridors, never shouting, never angry, but relentless. When she finally reached her chamber and shut the door behind her, the sound did not stop. It pressed against the wood, seeping through like smoke, whispering still, her name repeated with eerie tenderness, each syllable a caress and a warning. She lit another candle with shaking hands and waited, back pressed to the wall, until dawn's grey light bled weakly through the window panes. But even then, as the first pale beams touched the floorboards, she could still hear them faintly, distant but constant, the voices of the house, whispering from within the walls, calling for her to listen. By the time Clara found the ledger, she was no longer certain how many days she had been inside the Addington Manor. Time had lost its order within those walls, the sun, when it appeared at all, seemed reluctant to touch the house, and night arrived without transition, as though the world outside had forgotten how to move forward. Sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by the whispers that rose from the floors and the slow, mournful groaning of the pipes. Her mind, sharpened by fear and sleeplessness, clung to the one thing it still trusted, curiosity. If the house wanted her to know its history, she would oblige it. And so, lantern in hand, she searched. The discovery came by accident. In one of the upper corridors, behind a rotted tapestry depicting a hunting scene, she noticed an uneven line in the wall. The plaster there had cracked away, exposing a small wooden recess. Inside, sealed beneath a layer of dust and cobwebs, lay a leather-bound book. Its cover was warped and split along the spine, the leather darkened by time and moisture. She carried it to the study, where the faint light of the grey afternoon slanted through the cracked window. The pages were brittle, the ink brown with age, and the handwriting elegant but hurried, as if the writer had been afraid of being discovered. The first entries were routine, records of wages, inventories of the household, expenses for renovations. But as she read deeper, the tone changed. The handwriting grew erratic, the words darker, and the name that appeared most often was not Addington, but Alaric Starr. Alaric Addington, the eldest son, had inherited the manor during the late 1800s. According to the ledger, he was obsessed with preservation of lineage, of legacy, of flesh itself. The entries described strange rituals conducted beneath the manor, preservations, as he called them, meant to bind the essence of life within the property. Servants were dismissed and replaced without explanation, guests invited to dinner vanished from record entirely. Clara's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. There were lists of names, each followed by a date, then a single word, *bound star. In the margins, someone, perhaps a later hand, had written short notes in faint pencil. They are not dead. They cannot be. Further entries reveal the details of these rituals. The Addingtons had come to believe that death was a condition of neglect, that memory, properly maintained, could keep the soul tethered. Each ceremony was held behind the ballroom curtains, where the walls had been constructed over hollow chambers. The participants were chosen, their images captured in paint before the ritual began, and then they were preserved through an offering of breath, binding their essence to the house itself. Clara read until her vision blurred. The words seemed to shift on the page, ink bleeding like old wounds. She flipped to the final entry, written in a trembling scrawl that cut deep into the paper, *, we are eternal, but not free. The walls remember every promise. The house is full, yet never quiet. The realization struck her with an icy clarity, the voices she had heard, the movement behind the curtains, even the bleeding portraits. The Addingtons had not died, they had been trapped, their spirits imprisoned within the manor's bones, sustained by the rituals their ancestors had begun. The whispers were their plea, not for vengeance, but for release. She dropped the ledger to the floor, its pages splaying open like a wound. The house seemed to shudder in response, as if aware that its secret had been uncovered. From somewhere deep within the walls came a faint moan, long and low, rising into a chorus of indistinct cries. The air grew colder. The flame of her lantern bent sideways as though pushed by an unseen wind. Clara backed toward the door, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whispers returned, stronger now, almost intelligible. They repeated her name, urgent, imploring. For the first time, she thought she could hear words beneath them, layered and desperate, below. Beneath. Free as. The sound surrounded her, echoing from every direction. She stumbled into the hallway, clutching the ledger to her chest. The walls pulsed faintly, the wallpaper swelling as if something moved behind it. Every portrait she passed seemed alive with motion, the eyes glinting, the painted lips quivering as if struggling to speak. Drawn by the voices, she found herself descending the grand staircase once more. The ballroom doors stood open, though she was certain she had closed them earlier. Inside, the crimson curtains stirred in the still air. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they became a single, resonant hum that filled the space. Clara approached the curtain slowly, the ledger slipping from her grasp and landing with a hollow thud. Beneath the curtains, she could see faint shapes pressing outward, hands, faces, outlines of bodies caught mid-motion. The whispers shifted into something like a sigh, and the air grew heavy with sorrow. Her lantern flickered violently. For an instant, the curtains parted, not by her touch but from within, revealing a glimpse of the space beyond, a narrow passage lined with blackened stone and, at its center, a pool of still, dark water. The reflections on its surface shimmered faintly, revealing faces she recognized from the portraits above. Their mouths opened and closed silently, their eyes glistening with tears. Then the curtains fell shut, and the whispers ceased. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Clara stood trembling, unable to move, the reality of what she had uncovered sinking into her bones. The Addingtons had built their immortality into the house, but in doing so had created their own tomb. The manor did not merely remember them, it contained them, feeding on their voices, their memories, their souls. The house itself was alive, and it would never let them, or anyone who heard them, leave.